Good morning, welcome to another video from Devon Pond Plants explaining what to do with your pond plants in the autumn. Generally speaking, by this time of year, which is mid-September, it's a beautiful sunny day here in Devon, but it probably won't last. Generally speaking, a lot of the pond plants you have in your pond are going to be looking fairly straggly, and they're beginning to die back and go dormant for the autumn. So I want to tell you some little hints and tips about what to do with your pond plants to keep them in the best condition, and generally speaking, end of season plant care. So I'm picking a couple of examples here now. This is a Caltha palustris. This is a marsh marigold. Now this plant is a very early season plant, flowering in April and May, sometimes later again when it's cut back. And by now it's going to be looking something like this. A lot of the leaves have already disappeared actually, and the ones to the left have got black spots on. This is all perfectly normal as the plant dies back for the autumn. And with plants like this, it's a simple matter of just cutting back right to the crown. So cut off all the leaves and stems. There's just a little bit sticking out of the pot, and this will do two things. It will remove all of this rotting material from the pond and stopping it from producing nutrients which will contribute towards blanket weed and algae problems in the spring. And it will also stimulate the plant to produce new buds and growth low down in the spring. So such plants are very simple to take care of. Just cut off the excess foliage and throw it away, take it out of the pond. Here's another example. This is Butamus umbellatus. This is flowering rush. This one generally flowers in June, and once it's finished flowering it very quickly starts to brown off and go like this, and it will be producing new buds low down here which you can't see, but all of this material is going to just die off and go brown and eventually rot into the pond, increasing the level of nutrients in the water. And that's the enemy. You don't want pond water that's rich in nutrients, because if you do have that, you will get a lot more problems with algae. So again, the thing to do with the plant is just to cut it right back to the crown, removing any dead material, and that will stimulate the plant to produce more buds on the rootstock and keep it healthy for the spring. Now there are some exceptions to this cutting completely back generality, and here's one here. This is Myosotis. This is water forget-me-not. Now this, instead of growing upright, grows pretty much horizontally, and the plant grows away from the center, and all the best newest growth is right on the very end of the plant. And typically with this sort of plant you will get new roots forming just towards the end of the plant where the stem is in the water. It will produce new roots. Can't show you on that Myosotis, but I can certainly show you on that Lysimachia lots of new roots forming on the stem. The older central part of the plant from where it started progressively becomes woodier and more unproductive. But you can still cut these sorts of plants back 2 or 3 times with no ill effect at all, but the more you do that, the slower they will be to regenerate, and eventually the old plant will become unproductive and refuse to grow or flower particularly well. Now this one has some new growth coming up at the crown, and so this new growth can be left behind, but all of this older material here can be cut right back as before to remove all that black rotting material from the pond. And that will very quickly generate new shoots, but it won't grow very much more this season and will die back and eventually start growing again in the spring. However, you can take these shoots from the end and take cuttings from them and plant them up as new plants. And you can find out how to do that in my book, which I'll show at the end of this video. So that is a general rule for soft-bodied plants like Myosotis and Lysimachia nummularia. Just give them a tidy up, use some of this excess material to make some new cuttings and new plants for the spring, and that's about it. Now here is an example of a plant which you shouldn't cut right back to the crown each year, although it will regenerate. It would be quite reluctant to do so. But this is Bog Bean. This will grow in a rambling manner out from a central point, rooting into the water as it goes. So the stems are horizontal and the roots vertical, and these stems, even though the leaves will disappear in the winter, the stems will persist, and this will be very useful early habitat for frogs and newts that are spawning in your pond in the early part of the year. Gives them something to get in among, somewhere to spawn their eggs. And if you remove all this material now at this time of the year in September, there'll be nothing there for the frogs to get in among. So plants with stiff, persistent stems like Bog Bean, also this one here, which is Potentilla palustris, which grows in a very similar way with rambling stems that root into the pond as they go. Leave these stems on. The leaves will eventually die back. Probably not practical to cut them off on an individual level, but leave these sorts of plants with stiff, slightly woody, rambling stems until the spring, till the frogs have had a chance to spawn in among them and get a little bit of early surface cover. This is a Lithum, salicaria, and in common with many woody plants like this and most perennials in the garden, you shouldn't cut them back high up, but they need to be pruned right back to the base in order to generate new buds at the base. This will not grow from up here in the spring at all. The only new growth will come from close to the ground. So once again, you can cut them right back. You can see the old stems from the previous year there. Cut this plant right back to about 5 to 10 centimeters and remove that material. If you want to keep some seeds and try growing plants from seed, you can do, but these are usually fairly prolific plants and you really don't need to worry too much about them. So that plant now can have the top of the pot weeded, and that is fine to go on to the spring. And here are two examples of a plant called Gallingale. This is Cypress longus, a native plant. This one is a fresher, younger plant that was potted up not very long ago, and you can see it's much greener and healthier looking than this large one here, and the reason for that is that this one has been in the pot for a long time. Look at all the roots coming through the side of the pot. The stems are right up against the side of the pot. It's starting to burst through the pot in several places. This plant is running out of nutrients in the pot, so it's going a bit yellow and it's starting to struggle a bit. Now, you could repot this plant now at this time of year in September, and provided we get a few more weeks of decent weather, which down here in Devon we definitely will, it'll grow away and produce new shoots at the base. But generally speaking, I would advise leaving plants like this until the spring to repot, because when they are growing actively, they will get away to a much better start. Once again, it needs to be cut off right to the base. Now on this plant here, there is a new shoot coming up here. That is a new healthy shoot, so I'm not going to cut that one off. But all these old shoots that have flowered are going to come right off at the base, and the plant will very soon produce lots of new shoots in the spring. Now we're cutting these shoots right back at the base, leaving any brand new shoots like this one here, but taking away all the old yellowing and dying material to prevent it from rotting back into the pond. Now, all this root material on the outside of the pot, with the exception of the few weeds and bits of moss that are stuck in it, all of this will not die back in the winter because it's live root material. So there's no need to actually remove this in the autumn at this time of year. You might just want to give it a little bit of a tidy up to remove the excess, but generally speaking all of this can remain. And once again, it's good useful habitat for small insects and beasts of all kinds to get in among in the spring and do their breeding, because if you cut all this material off now, very little more is going to be produced until the spring comes along. So generally speaking, I would leave any brand new shoots and any roots until the spring. And come springtime, this plant is going to need repotting. Ideally, repot before the shoots come out of the side of the pot, because it's more difficult then to retain these and use them again, but often they can be used. And even though I probably wouldn't mostly do my propagation at this time of year, in this case I'm going to decide to split this plant now. So I have a range of fearsome tools that we use to deal with plants like this. They're very, very tough. You can be absolutely brutal with them and you'll do very little damage. So the first thing will be to cut off all this material on the outside of the pot, because until you do that you won't be able to get the bulk of the plant out of the pot. So this little shoot here, I'm just going to cut off fairly carefully. You can see it's come off with a couple of little roots on there, and if that's potted up into a little pot, that'll grow away perfectly happily. So I'll put him to one side and just cut off the rest of the material from the side of the pot. An old kitchen knife like this is absolutely ideal for the purpose. We have to keep sharpening our knives because they get blunted very quickly doing this sort of a job with all the grit and roots and so on. But it's a good tool for the job. So that's all the roots removed from the outside of the pot. And from the bottom of the pot. So in this case I'm going to try to get it out of the pot. I'm just going to bump it on the corner of the bench here, upside down, and that's just loosened it in the pot. And I can now remove the whole root ball from the pot. Now that pot could be used again, there's a few holes in it, but it's still good to go for another time. And this is the plant. Now I could plant this directly into a much larger pot, and that would be fine if you have a large pond or a large shelf to put it on, but most likely you'll probably want to be splitting it into 2 or 3 chunks. And to do that, again, it's just brute force and ignorance really. Just choose a place where there's less material, cut through it and pull it apart, and generally speaking with most plants you'll end up with sections like this, with a little bit of root and a little bit of shoot, and you can do that a number of times. Don't over divide the plant. 3 or 4 pieces is probably about right in most cases. And this one then is ready for potting up, as you will have seen me do on the previous video entitled Potting Up Your Pond Plants. As I say, these jobs are best done in the spring when the plant is growing actively, because now that I've done this, all of these cut roots here are susceptible to getting a bit of rot in, and if the weather was to suddenly turn, it gets very cold, the plant isn't going to grow at all, it's just going to be sitting in cold wet soil, and it's possible that it could get root rots and infections going in it. But most plants are very tough and can be done pretty much any time when the weather's reasonably warm. So you've just seen me pot up one of those Cypress longus. This is the younger, newer one. So I'm not going to do anything much with that at all yet. There's still green material on here. There are new shoots coming. There are flowers still coming. So that's going to be good for another few weeks yet. But when this all starts to brown off, again, it'll all be cut off at pot level and it'll be ready for the spring. While I'm talking to you about end of season plant care, people often ask about sediment and leaves in the pond. A small amount of sediment and leaves in a pond is a good thing because it's habitat for invertebrates and other animals to live in, and provides a certain amount of habitat for everything else. But if you have an excess of such things in the pond, it's not a good thing, because all of that rotting material in the bottom of the pond is going to produce dissolved nutrients in the water, and in the spring the first thing to grow will be the nuisance algae like blanket weed and green water generally. And so therefore, if you want to have a reasonably clear pond, you need to minimise the amount of sediment in the bottom of your pond. So if you have a small pond close to some trees which gets a lot of leaf fall, it's not a bad idea to net over the pond. I'm not generally in favour of permanent netting on ponds. I think it looks unattractive, but if necessary, you can do that. But if you net your pond and remove the worst of the autumn leaves, it's certainly worth doing. Now, if your pond is very overgrown and is due a complete clear out, this is probably about the best time of year to do it. Most of the creatures have done their reproduction, amphibians have generally left the pond, and generally the wildlife in the pond is at a low at this time of year. So before the water gets too cold and unfriendly, now is the time to do any clearance of silt and leaves and excess material in the bottom of the pond. Because if you don't do this occasionally, the level of nutrients in the water in the pond will rise, and that's what's going to give you problems with blanket weed and algae in the early spring. So if you want to have a good clear out, now's the time to do it. A couple of little tips. Before you start, get a few buckets of clean water out of the pond before you start stirring anything up. So you can transfer any animals that you do find into clean water at the temperature of the pond, and not into the last 3 bucketfuls of soup that you'll end up with at the end. So a few bucketfuls of clean water out of the pond first. Go in and do what you need to do, remove any silt and sediment. You don't have to end up with a pond that's clean like a hospital operating theatre, but most of the silt and leaves can be removed from a pond, and that will be beneficial rather than harmful. Cut all the plants back while you're at it. Propagate anything that you feel you need to be propagated now, but leave most of your propagation until the spring. Then when you refill the pond, give it a little bit of time before you reintroduce the animals that are in your buckets, so that the water will warm up to the ambient temperature, and then you can reintroduce the animals that you've saved back into the pond again safely. If you don't do that, obviously you're taking the animals from a nice warm, mature environment into some cold tap water, and that's probably not going to do them the best of good. Well, hopefully by now you'll understand what to do with your pond plants in the autumn, and how to keep your pond reasonably clean to prevent nutrient buildup. And if you want to know any more about many of these topics, you could buy my book entitled Ponds, A Practical Guide to Design, Construction and Planting, and that'll give you a lot more hints and tips about how to do all these things and what different approaches to take with different plants. Hope you have fun in your pond this autumn.